Daniel Reeves smiled at Victor Moretti and lied straight to his face. "They agree to every condition," he said in perfect, calm English, while the German investor across the table had just whispered the exact opposite in German, a plan to strip Victor of his shipping empire and bury him with it. Victor picked up the pen. He had seconds left to live, and he didn't know it yet. "Before we continue, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and stay with me until the very end, because what happens next will stay with you long after tonight." Nobody in that private dining room knew that the quiet woman refilling their water glasses could understand every word the Germans were saying. That was the twist nobody saw coming. Not Victor Moretti, not his trusted translator, not the men across the table who thought they had already won. Emily Carter had spent 3 years of her life in Germany, and she hadn't spent them in classrooms. She'd spent them in kitchens, in hospital waiting rooms, in the back alleys of Berlin where people didn't speak textbook German. They spoke fast, sharp, real German, the kind that came out when men forgot a woman standing nearby might actually be listening. Tonight, that woman was standing 3 feet away from the most dangerous man in New York, and she was the only person alive who knew he was about to die. It hadn't started that way. It had started like every other Tuesday shift. Tired feet, an apron that smelled like garlic and candle wax, and a manager named Lewis who never once said her name without sounding annoyed. "Carter, private room 4, go." 4? That's not my station. Tonight, it is. Big client, very big. You don't talk unless spoken to, you don't linger, you don't make eye contact unless they make it first. You understand me? Emily wiped her hands on her apron. "Who is it?" Louis leaned in close, his voice dropping to something just above a whisper, like the walls themselves might report back. "Moretti." The name landed like a dropped plate. Every waiter within earshot went still for half a second, the way people go still when they hear a name that isn't supposed to be said out loud in a restaurant full of strangers. Emily had heard it before. Everyone in this city had heard it before, whispered in the same breath as words like danger and don't ask questions and just serve the wine and get out. "Victor Moretti," she repeated, quieter this time. "You have a problem with that?" She thought about her mother lying in a hospital bed 2 boroughs away, the surgery bill sitting on the kitchen counter like a countdown clock. She thought about rent. She thought about how a single bad night at this job could end with her unemployed by morning, and how she genuinely could not afford that. "No," she said. "No problem." "Good. Then smile, pour the wine, and don't be stupid." She would remember those words for the rest of her life. Don't be stupid. Because in less than an hour, she was going to do the single most reckless thing she had ever done, and it would save a man's life. The private room was colder than the rest of the restaurant, or maybe that was just her imagination working overtime. Emily set the wine glasses one by one, counting them silently to keep her hands from shaking, and that was when the door opened, and the air itself seemed to change. She didn't need anyone to tell her which man was Victor Moretti. He walked into the room the way a held breath fills a chest. Quiet, controlled, and impossible to ignore. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. 2 men flanked him, close enough to be useful, far enough to be invisible. And when Victor sat down, the entire room adjusted itself around him without a single word being spoken. Beside him sat another man, younger, sharper dressed, carrying a leather folder under one arm like it contained something sacred. Emily learned his name within the first 2 minutes because Victor said it the way you say the name of someone you trust with your life. "Daniel. They're on their way up? Should be here any minute, Victor." Daniel Reeves had a voice built for reassurance. Smooth, warm, the kind of voice that made people relax. "I've reviewed the contract twice more since this morning. Everything is clean." "It better be." Victor's eyes moved briefly toward Emily as she set down the final glass, and for one unbearable second, she thought he was going to say something to her. He didn't. His attention returned to Daniel like she had never existed at all. That was fine. That was expected. That was, in fact, exactly what Emily needed. To be furniture, to be background, to be nothing worth remembering. She would not stay nothing for long. The Germans arrived 12 minutes later, Two men, one older, silver-haired, introduced as Herr Brandt, and a younger associate named Klaus, who carried himself like a man auditioning for his boss's approval. Daniel rose to greet them in fluent German, warm and welcoming, and Emily busied herself refilling water glasses at the far end of the table, close enough to hear, invisible enough to be ignored. "Herr Moretti is very pleased you could join us tonight," Daniel said in German, extending a hand. Brandt shook it, smiling thinly. Then, in German, to Klaus, low enough that he clearly believed no one but his associate could understand, "He has no idea what's coming." Emily's hand froze around the neck of a wine bottle. Klaus murmured something back too quiet to catch. Brandt's smile widened, aimed now at Victor, transforming instantly into something warm and diplomatic. "Herr Moretti," he said, and Daniel translated smoothly, "Thank you for hosting us. We're eager to discuss the future of our partnership." Victor nodded, unreadable. "Tell him the pleasure's mine. Let's talk shipping routes." Daniel translated. The conversation began to flow. Numbers, terminals, timelines, ordinary business language that would have put anyone else to sleep. Emily kept moving along the edges of the room, pouring, clearing, refilling, every muscle in her body performing the choreography of invisibility, while her mind raced through what she'd just heard. He has no idea what's coming. It could have meant anything: a surprise clause, a negotiation tactic, a joke between colleagues. She told herself that for exactly 4 more minutes, until Brandt leaned toward Klaus again and said in German, low and fast, "Once he signs, the western route is ours. After that, he's no longer useful." Klaus in German, "And the American?" Brandt, without even glancing up from his wine, "Removed, quietly if possible." Emily set down a water pitcher with more force than she meant to, and the clink of glass against glass made Victor's eyes flick toward her for half a second. She forced her face into something neutral, something bored, something that belonged to a woman who understood nothing but English and tips. Her heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she was certain someone would hear it. Removed. She had heard that word used casually before, back in Berlin, in conversations that made her blood run cold even then. It never meant a business decision. It never meant a polite goodbye. She knew exactly what it meant, and she knew exactly who it was aimed at, and the man it was aimed at was sitting 6 feet away from her, laughing quietly at something his lawyer had just said, completely unaware that the men across the table had already decided he was a dead man walking. She wanted to run. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to set down the tray, walk out of that room, finish her shift somewhere far away from whatever was about to happen, and forget she had ever heard a single word of German in her life. But then Daniel spoke again, translating Brandt's next sentence, and Emily's whole body went cold in a completely different way. Brandt, in German, had just said, "Tell him we accept every condition in the contract exactly as written. We're ready to sign tonight." That was true. That part Daniel translated correctly. But then Brandt added something else, quieter, almost an afterthought, meant only for Klaus. Something about the second shipment being handled separately, off the books, once the transition was complete. Daniel didn't translate that part at all. He simply smiled at Victor and said, "They're ready to sign whenever you are." Emily stood absolutely still, a fresh bottle of wine sweating in her hand, and understood with sudden, sickening clarity that the danger wasn't only coming from the Germans. It was coming from the man sitting right beside Victor, the man he trusted with his life, the man translating every word that passed between him and the people planning to kill him, and choosing deliberately what Victor was allowed to hear. Daniel was lying to him, not mistranslating, not missing a nuance, lying, on purpose, leaving out exactly the parts that would have made Victor pause, made him ask questions, made him do anything other than reach for that pen. Emily's mind raced through every possible explanation and landed on none of them that made sense, except the one that scared her most. Daniel wasn't confused, and he wasn't careless. He was part of it. She almost dropped the bottle. "You all right?" one of Victor's men murmured, close enough that she jumped. "Fine," she said quickly, too quickly. "Sorry. Long shift." He studied her for a beat longer than she liked, then looked away, and Emily used the 3 seconds she'd bought herself to remember how to breathe. "Think, Emily. Think." She could tell someone. She could interrupt, announce what she'd heard, throw herself into the middle of a business deal between a mafia boss and a group of men planning to murder him. She could imagine exactly how that would go. Best case, she was fired on the spot and thrown out into the rain for making up wild accusations about a client. Worst case, she didn't want to think about worst case. She could say nothing, finish her shift, go home, sit beside her mother's hospital bed tomorrow, and never think about this restaurant again. Whatever happened to Victor Moretti after tonight would happen whether or not she opened her mouth. It wasn't her business. It wasn't her fight. Nobody would ever know she'd understood a single word. That thought should have comforted her. It didn't. Because Emily remembered something else from her years in Germany. A memory she rarely let herself touch, because it still hurt in a place that hadn't healed. A neighbor, an elderly man 2 doors down from the tiny apartment she'd shared with her aunt. A man everyone in the building liked and nobody paid attention to. She remembered overhearing a conversation once, in a stairwell, 2 men talking about him in low voices, about money he owed, about a message that needed to be sent. She had been 19. She had told herself it wasn't her business. 3 days later, the old man was gone, and the silence in that stairwell had followed her every single day since. She was not going to carry a silence like that twice. Her hands were shaking as she reached for the tray again, and this time she didn't try to stop them. She had a plan forming, reckless and half-finished, but a plan nonetheless. And there was no time left to second-guess it, because Brandt was already sliding the contract across the table, and Daniel was already reaching for a pen to hand to Victor, and Victor's fingers were already closing around it. "Everything checks out," Daniel said, warm as ever. "Whenever you're ready." Victor uncapped the pen. Emily's entire body moved before her mind finished deciding. She stepped forward with the wine bottle in her hand, angled it just slightly wrong, and let it tip. Not obviously, not clumsily enough to look staged, just enough. The deep red wine spilled across the table in a sudden, ugly wave, splashing directly onto Daniel's crisp gray suit and across the edge of the contract itself. The room exploded into motion. Klaus jumped back with a sharp curse in German. Brandt's chair scraped violently against the floor. One of Victor's men had a hand inside his jacket before Emily even registered he'd moved. Daniel shot up out of his seat, staring down at the dark stains spreading across his sleeve, sputtering something between shock and fury. "I am so sorry. I am so sorry, sir. Let me—" Emily was already grabbing napkins, dabbing frantically at the mess, her voice pitched into exactly the kind of panic a horrified waitress should sound like. It wasn't hard to fake. Half of it wasn't fake at all. "Get her out of here," Klaus snapped in English, his accent sharp with anger. "It's fine," Victor said. His voice was flat, calm, cutting through the noise like a blade through fabric. "Accidents happen." But Emily wasn't focused on the noise anymore. She was focused on the 3 feet of space between herself and Victor Moretti, and the fact that everyone in that room, Daniel, Klaus, Brandt, even Victor's own men, was looking at the wine, at Daniel's ruined jacket, at the soaked contract, and not at her. She leaned in, as if reaching for another napkin near Victor's side of the table, and in the half-second nobody was watching her mouth, she said 4 words, barely louder than breath. "Your translator is lying." She straightened up instantly, stepped back, kept dabbing uselessly at the table, as if she'd said nothing at all. Victor didn't move. He didn't turn his head, he didn't blink. To anyone watching, he looked like a man mildly irritated by a spilled bottle of wine, nothing more. But Emily, close enough to see it, watched his hand tighten around the pen still resting between his fingers, a grip so sudden and so controlled that she understood, with absolute certainty, that he had heard every word. And she understood something else, too, in that same instant. He believed her. Not because he had any reason to trust a stranger, a waitress he'd never spoken to, a woman who had just made a scene in front of his most important business deal of the year. He believed her because some quiet, cold part of him had already been waiting for exactly this. Some instinct he'd been ignoring for weeks had just been confirmed by 4 whispered words, and men like Victor Moretti did not survive as long as he had by ignoring instincts twice. "Daniel," Victor said, still calm, still unreadable, "get cleaned up. We'll finish this after the mess is handled." "Of course," Daniel said, already dabbing furiously at his jacket, oblivious to anything except the ruined fabric. "I apologize, gentlemen, please." Brant waved a hand, smiling that same thin, diplomatic smile. "No trouble at all. These things happen." But Emily saw it, the flicker of irritation behind Brant's eyes, gone almost as fast as it appeared, the look of a man whose careful timing had just been knocked slightly off course by an accident he hadn't planned for. She kept her head down, gathering the ruined napkins, moving with the exact rhythm of a mortified employee trying to disappear from an embarrassing situation. Inside, her heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might crack a rib. She had done it. She had actually done it. And now there was no undoing it. "I'll get you a fresh table setting," she said quickly, to no one in particular, and turned to leave the room before anyone could look at her too closely. She didn't get far. A hand closed gently but firmly around her upper arm just as she reached the door. Not rough, not threatening, but absolutely immovable. She turned, already bracing for Louis, already rehearsing an apology about the spilled wine. It wasn't Louis. It was one of Victor's men, the same one who'd caught her staring earlier, and his expression told her this was not a conversation she was going to be allowed to skip. "Mr. Moretti wants a word," he said quietly, "after the meeting." Emily's mouth went dry. "I have other tables," he said after the meeting. The man's tone left no room for negotiation. "Don't leave the restaurant." He released her arm and walked back into the private room without another word, leaving Emily standing frozen in the hallway, her pulse hammering, the ruined napkins still bundled uselessly in her hands. She had wanted to save a man's life. She hadn't stopped to think about what would happen after. Behind the closed door, the meeting resumed. Voices low, businesslike, the German smoothing over the small delay with practiced charm, Daniel returning in a fresh jacket someone had produced from somewhere, apologizing again for the mess, translating again, smiling again like nothing at all had happened. But something had changed, and Emily could feel it even from the hallway, even without seeing Victor's face. The rhythm of the room was different now, slower, more careful. A man who had been seconds from signing his own death warrant was no longer in a hurry to pick up that pen again, and every second he delayed was a second the Germans hadn't planned for. Emily pressed her back against the wall outside the private room, trying to steady her breathing, trying to convince herself that whatever happened next, she had done the right thing. She thought of her mother, lying in that hospital bed, completely unaware that her daughter had just inserted herself into the middle of a war between a mafia boss and a group of men plotting to kill him. She thought about walking out the back door right now, disappearing into the rain, pretending none of this had happened. She thought about the old man in Berlin and the silence that had followed her for years. She stayed. 15 minutes later, the meeting ended. Emily heard chairs scraping, low German farewells exchanged, footsteps moving toward the door. She straightened up quickly, smoothing her apron, trying to look like an employee waiting to clear a table and nothing more. Brant and Klaus emerged first, shaking hands with Daniel on their way out, all warmth and smiles, men who believed their plan was still perfectly intact. Brant's eyes swept briefly over Emily as he passed, and for one terrifying second, she thought he recognized something in her face. He didn't. He simply nodded, the polite, dismissive nod powerful men give the staff, and walked on. Daniel followed a moment later, already pulling out his phone, texting someone, laughing quietly at whatever he'd typed. He didn't look at Emily at all. Why would he? To him, she was nothing. A waitress who'd spilled some wine. Forgettable. That was about to change. The two bodyguards came next, and then finally Victor Moretti stepped out of the private room alone, and for the first time all night, he looked directly at Emily. Not past her, not through her, but at her, with an intensity that made her want to shrink into the wall behind her. "Wait here," he said. Not a request. He walked past her toward the front of the restaurant, presumably to see his guests off, leaving Emily standing in the hallway with her heart in her throat, absolutely certain that in the next few minutes, her entire life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. She thought about running. She thought about it seriously, calculated the distance to the back exit, the time it would take to grab her coat, whether Louis would even notice her gone before her shift technically ended. She thought about all of it, And then she stayed exactly where she was, because some part of her understood, with a certainty that surprised her, that this wasn't over, not for Victor and not for her. 10 minutes later, Victor Moretti walked back down that hallway alone, his 2 bodyguards waiting a respectful distance behind him, and stopped directly in front of Emily Carter for the first time all night. He studied her for a long moment, the kind of look that made her feel like he was reading something written on her face that she hadn't meant to show anyone. "How do you know German?" he asked quietly. And Emily Carter, waitress, invisible woman, the only person in that entire restaurant who had heard the truth, understood in that instant that there was no version of tonight where she simply went home and forgot any of this had ever happened. Victor Moretti didn't blink as he waited for an answer, and Emily understood that this was not a man who asked casual questions. Every word out of his mouth had weight. Every silence had purpose. "I lived in Germany," she said, keeping her voice steady, even though her knees felt like they might give out. 3 years. My aunt married a man from Hamburg. I went to school there for a while, then I just stayed. Worked odd jobs. Learned the language because I had to, not because I wanted to impress anyone." "You learned it well enough to catch a translator lying in real time." "I learned it well enough to survive," Emily said. "That's different from being polished. Nobody taught me business German in a classroom. I learned it in kitchens, in hospital corridors, in places where people didn't think a foreign girl mopping floors could understand a single word they said." Something shifted behind Victor's eyes, not quite warmth, but recognition. He knew exactly what it meant to be underestimated in a room. He'd built an empire out of it. "Say it again," he said quietly. "What you told me at the table." Emily's throat tightened. She glanced past his shoulder toward the 2 men waiting a few feet back, then toward the front of the restaurant, where Louis was pretending not to watch this entire exchange while wiping the same clean glass for the 3rd time. "Your translator is lying to you," she said. "Not mistakes, not missing a phrase here and there. He's leaving things out on purpose, whole sentences, the important ones." "Which sentences?" It wasn't a question. It was an order dressed up as one. Emily exhaled shakily. "The German men, Brandt and the younger one, Klaus, they said something before your translator ever opened his mouth to greet them. Brandt told Klaus you had no idea what was coming. Later, when you were talking shipping routes, Brandt said that once you sign, the western route belongs to them, and after that, you're no longer useful." Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Go on." "Then he said—" Emily hesitated, because saying it out loud made it real in a way that whispering it across a dinner table hadn't. "He said you'd be removed, quietly if possible, and your translator, Daniel, he heard every word of it. He translated the parts about the contract terms perfectly. He just never told you any of that." The silence that followed felt like it lasted an hour, though it couldn't have been more than 5 seconds. One of Victor's men shifted his weight. Somewhere behind the kitchen doors, a pan clattered against a stove, and Emily flinched at the sound like it had been a gunshot. "You understand what you just told me," Victor said finally. It wasn't a question either. "I understand you almost signed a contract that would have gotten you killed." "I mean the part where you just accused a man I've known for 6 years of setting me up to die." Emily's stomach dropped. She hadn't thought about it that way, not fully, not with the weight it deserved. But he was right. She hadn't just exposed a business betrayal. She'd accused Daniel Reeves, a man who had presumably earned Victor's trust over years, of being complicit in a plan to murder him. And she'd done it with nothing but her own ears as proof. "I know what I heard," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, even as her hands trembled at her sides. "I don't know why he did it. I don't know if he's being paid or threatened or if he just hates you. I only know what came out of his mouth versus what came out of theirs, and they didn't match." Victor studied her for another long moment, and Emily made herself hold his gaze, even though every instinct told her to look away, to apologize, to shrink back into the invisible waitress she'd been an hour ago. "You could be wrong," he said. "I'm not. You could be working an angle, setting Daniel up, trying to get close to me for reasons that have nothing to do with tonight." Emily felt something hot flare up under her ribs, not fear this time, but anger. If I wanted an angle, Mr. Moretti, I wouldn't have spilled an entire bottle of wine on a $200 suit and risked getting fired on the spot. I'd have found a quieter way to get your attention. I did the stupidest, most reckless thing I have ever done in my life tonight, and I did it because I couldn't stand there and watch you sign your own death sentence while I did nothing. That's it. That's the whole angle. For the first time all night, something almost like the ghost of a smile crossed Victor's face. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Sit down," he said, gesturing toward a small table near the back of the restaurant, away from the windows, away from anyone who might be watching. "I have other tables," Emily said automatically, old habits fighting their way to the surface even now. "Not tonight, you don't." Victor glanced toward Louis, who was suddenly very interested in polishing silverware. "Give me 5 minutes with your employee. She's not in trouble." Louis nodded so fast, Emily thought his neck might snap. She sat. Victor sat across from her, and for the first time, she saw him not as a name whispered in fear across the city, but as a man, tired around the eyes, calculating but undeniably human, turning a possibility over in his mind that he clearly hadn't expected to face tonight. "Tell me something," he said. "If Daniel's been lying to me, and I'm not saying I believe it yet, I'm saying how long do you think it's been going on?" Emily thought back over the meeting, every phrase, every gesture. "Tonight, definitely. I don't know about before tonight. I only understood what happened in that one room. He handled negotiations for me in Munich 2 months ago, alone. No one else in the room spoke German." The implication sat heavy between them. If Daniel had been lying tonight, there was no reason to believe tonight was the first time. "Do you have a way to check what actually happened in Munich?" Emily asked. "Recordings, notes, anything?" "There's a recording," Victor said slowly, like the thought was only now taking full shape in his mind. "I have someone I trust who can pull it. If Daniel's been feeding me half-truths for 2 months, I need to know exactly what I signed and what I didn't." "Then you should find out before you do anything else," Emily said, "before you confront him, before you let him know you suspect anything." Victor's eyes sharpened, studying her with new interest. "You think like someone who's had to survive people lying to her before." Emily didn't answer that. She didn't need to. The silence said enough. "Here's my problem," Victor said, leaning back slightly, his voice dropping lower, more careful. "If I confront Daniel tonight, I tip my hand. If he's working with the Germans, he warns them, and whatever they're planning next, they move it up before I'm ready. If I say nothing and go on trusting him, I'm walking blind into whatever comes after tonight." "So don't do either," Emily said before she could stop herself. "Excuse me? Don't confront him, and don't trust him either. Watch him. Let him think everything's fine. But don't let him translate anything important again without someone else in the room who actually understands what's being said." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're suggesting yourself." Emily's mouth went dry. She hadn't meant to suggest anything. The words had come out ahead of her thoughts, the way they sometimes did when adrenaline was still burning through her system. But now that they hung in the air, she realized she meant them. "I'm saying I already know what he's capable of," she said carefully. "I already caught him once. I'd catch him again. You have no idea what you'd be walking into." "I have some idea," Emily said. "I just watched 2 men calmly discuss killing you like they were discussing lunch reservations. I think I have a pretty good idea." Victor studied her for a long moment, something calculating moving behind his eyes, and Emily had the distinct sensation of being weighed, not as a woman, not as a waitress, but as an asset, a variable, a piece that might or might not fit into whatever came next. "You have a family?" he asked, abruptly changing direction. The question caught her off guard. "My mother, she's sick. That's actually why I'm working double shifts most weeks. Hospital bills don't pay themselves." "What's wrong with her?" Emily hesitated. She didn't like discussing her mother's illness with strangers, and Victor Moretti was about as much of a stranger as a person could be. But something about the way he asked, direct, unembellished, without pity dripping from every word, made her answer honestly. "Heart condition. She needs a procedure the insurance keeps finding new ways to deny. I've been picking up every shift I can to cover what's left." Victor nodded slowly, filing the information away like a man building a case. And if I offered to cover it, all of it. Emily blinked. I'm not asking you for money. I know you're not. That's exactly why I'm offering. He leaned forward slightly. You risked your job, possibly your safety, to warn a man you had every reason to walk away from. That's not something people do for money, but I don't leave debts unpaid, Miss Carter. Emily Carter. Miss Carter. He said her name like he was testing its weight. I don't leave debts unpaid, and right now, I owe you my life. That's not a debt I take lightly. Emily's chest tightened with something complicated, relief, disbelief, a flicker of hope for her mother that felt almost dangerous to allow herself. And in exchange? In exchange, Victor said, I need someone in that room the next time Daniel translates for me. Someone who understands every word being said and reports back to me exactly what's really happening, not what he decides I should hear. You want me to spy on him? I want you to protect me from him, if it comes to that. There's a difference. Emily sat with that for a moment, the weight of it settling slowly, like something cold sinking through water. This wasn't a job offer. This wasn't a tip for good service. This was an invitation into a world where lies got people killed, and loyalty was currency more valuable than money. A world she had spent her whole life carefully avoiding. If I say yes, she said slowly, what happens to me if the Germans find out I understand what they're saying? What happens if Daniel figures out I'm the reason his lie got caught? Victor didn't sugarcoat it. She would come to respect that about him later, the way he never once tried to make danger sound smaller than it was. Then you become a target, same as me. The moment you expose the betrayal, you already put yourself in that position, whether you agree to help me or not. The only real question now is whether you face that danger with protection or without it. The words landed like ice water down her spine. She hadn't fully considered it. Not really, not in the frantic minutes after she'd whispered those 4 words across the table. She had thought about the consequences of staying silent. She hadn't thought hard enough about the consequences of speaking up. I have work tomorrow, she said weakly, grasping for something normal, something that still made sense. I have my mother to check on. I can't just... You can't just what? Disappear into a war you already stepped into the moment you opened your mouth? Victor's voice wasn't unkind, but it wasn't gentle either. It was honest, and honesty from a man like him felt more dangerous than any threat. Miss Carter, I'm not asking you to choose between your old life and a new one. That choice was already made for you the second you decided not to stay quiet. I'm asking you to choose between facing what comes next with my protection, or facing it alone. Emily's hands curled into fists in her lap, nails biting into her palms, the sting grounding her in a moment that felt like it was spinning too fast to hold on to. She thought about Louis, about her tiny apartment with the leaking faucet, about her mother's face when she visited every Sunday, pale against hospital pillows, still smiling like nothing in the world could take her daughter down. She thought about the old man in Berlin, the silence that followed her for years because she'd told herself it wasn't her business. Okay, she heard herself say. Victor's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, like a decision had just been finalized in his mind. Okay to which part? All of it, Emily said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'll help you. I'll be in the room. I'll tell you exactly what's being said, every word, no matter how bad it is. And in return, your mother's medical bills are handled, every cent, starting tomorrow. I don't want that to be the reason I do this. It doesn't have to be the only reason, Victor said. It can still be a reason. For the first time since he'd walked into that private room hours earlier, Victor Moretti extended his hand across the table. Not the gesture of a boss to an employee, not quite the gesture of an equal either, but something new, something being built in real time between two people who had no reason to trust each other, and every reason to need each other now. Emily shook it. His grip was firm, controlled, the handshake of a man who had sealed far more dangerous deals than this one across far more dangerous tables. Welcome to a very complicated situation, Miss Carter. Please, Emily said, some of the tension finally cracking into something almost like dark humor. Call me Emily. Miss Carter makes it sound like I'm about to get fired. You're not getting fired, Victor said. Louis! Lewis nearly dropped the glass he was polishing. Yes, Mr. Moretti? Miss Carter is done for the night. In fact, she's done working here entirely. Consider this her 2 weeks' notice, effective immediately, and consider her final paycheck doubled for the inconvenience. Louis's mouth opened, closed, opened again, clearly torn between confusion and the overwhelming urge not to argue with the man who had just quietly rearranged his employee's entire life in under 10 minutes. Of course, whatever you need, Mr. Moretti. Emily stared at Victor, stunned. You can't just fire me from my own job. I didn't fire you. I promoted you. Victor stood, adjusting his jacket, already shifting back into the composed, unreadable figure he'd been when he first walked through that door. Get your things. My car is outside. We have a great deal to discuss, and very little time to discuss it in. Wait, tonight? Now? The Germans think their plan is still moving forward exactly as scheduled, Victor said. That gives us a window, and windows like that don't stay open long. If Daniel warns them that anything's changed, that window closes fast. We move now, or we lose the only advantage we have. Emily's mind spun, trying to catch up to the speed of everything happening around her. An hour ago, she had been refilling water glasses, her biggest worry whether she'd make enough in tips to cover this month's rent. Now she was being swept into a car with one of the most feared men in New York, tasked with uncovering a conspiracy that could get them both killed. She grabbed her coat from the back room with shaking hands, said a hurried, mostly true excuse to a coworker who asked where she was going, and walked out the front door of the restaurant into a night that felt entirely different from the one she'd walked into hours earlier. A black car waited at the curb, engine running, one of Victor's men holding the door open. Emily hesitated for half a second. One last chance to turn back, to say this was a mistake, to disappear into the rain and let this entire night become nothing more than a strange story she'd tell no one. She got in the car. Victor slid in beside her and the door shut with a soft final click that felt heavier than it should have. First thing, Victor said as the car pulled away from the curb, I need to know everything Daniel said tonight, word for word, as close as you can remember it. Every phrase, every pause. I don't care how small it seems. Emily took a steadying breath and began walking him through it. The conversation with Klaus before the Germans even greeted him, the mention of the Western shipping route, the word removed, the omitted line about a second shipment being handled separately once the transition was complete. Victor listened without interrupting, his face a mask of controlled calculation, occasionally asking her to repeat a phrase exactly as she remembered hearing it. The second shipment, he said finally, almost to himself. That's not in any contract language we discussed. That's not part of the deal at all. What do you think it means? I think, Victor said slowly, it means the shipping routes were never really the point. I think Brandt's people are planning to move something through my terminals that has nothing to do with legitimate cargo, and they were counting on controlling those routes without me around to ask questions about what's actually inside the containers. Emily's stomach turned. Drugs? Could be worse. Victor's jaw tightened. Whatever it is, it's valuable enough that they were willing to plan a murder to secure it quietly, instead of negotiating for it honestly. That tells me it's not something they can risk being questioned about. The car moved through wet streets, streetlights sliding across the windows in long yellow streaks, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Emily stared out at the city passing by, feeling further from her old life with every block. Can I ask you something? She said finally. You can ask. Why didn't you feel it? The betrayal. You said earlier you already suspected something was wrong before I ever said anything. What tipped you off? Victor was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, his voice had lost some of its careful control. Just for a second. Just enough for Emily to see the man underneath the reputation. Daniel's been different the last few months, he said. Distracted. Late to meetings he used to show up early for. I told myself it was personal problems. A divorce maybe, or money trouble. I never let myself think it might be something worse, because Daniel's been with me since before I built half of what I have now. You don't want to believe the people closest to you would sell you out, so you find reasons not to look too hard. And now? Now I have to look harder than I've ever looked at anything in my life, Victor said. Because if I'm wrong about him, I'm about to destroy a man who's done nothing but serve me faithfully for 6 years. And if I'm right... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Emily's phone buzzed in her coat pocket, and she jumped so hard she nearly hit her head on the car window. She fumbled it out, heart pounding, half expecting the number to belong to someone connected to tonight's disaster. It was the hospital. "I have to take this," she said, and Victor nodded, watching her carefully as she answered. "Hello? Yes, this is Emily Carter." A pause. Her face went pale. "Is she okay? What happened?" Victor's expression sharpened, alert, reading the tension in her voice, even without hearing the other end of the call. Okay, I'll be there as soon as I can," Emily said, her voice cracking slightly at the edges. She hung up and sat frozen for a moment, staring at the phone in her lap. "What is it?" Victor asked. "My mother. She had some kind of episode a few hours ago. They stabilized her, but they need someone to sign off on additional testing, and I'm her only—" Emily's voice caught. "I need to get to the hospital now." Victor didn't hesitate. He leaned forward and tapped the partition separating them from the driver. "Mercy General, now fastest route you've got." "Sir, we're supposed to be heading toward—" "I said now." The car swung hard into the next turn, tires hissing against wet pavement, and Emily gripped the door handle, her mind splitting in two directions at once. Her mother, alone in a hospital bed, frightened and confused, and the conspiracy she'd just agreed to help unravel, already pulling her attention in the opposite direction. "You don't have to come with me," she said, though some small, terrified part of her didn't want to be alone right now, not after everything that had happened in the last 2 hours. "I'm already involved," Victor said simply. "Whatever's happening in your life right now, it's happening because of tonight, one way or another. I don't walk away from people I've made promises to." The car pulled up outside the hospital emergency entrance 12 minutes later, and Emily was out the door before it had fully stopped, her heart pounding with a fear that had nothing to do with Mafia bosses or German businessmen and everything to do with the woman who had raised her alone, who had worked 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads, who was lying somewhere inside that building hooked up to machines that beeped out the fragile rhythm of her heartbeat. Victor followed at a measured distance, letting her lead, letting her have this moment without inserting himself into it. Emily barely registered him behind her as she rushed to the front desk, breathless, giving her mother's name, waiting an agonizing 30 seconds for the nurse to pull up the chart. "She's stable," the nurse said finally, and Emily felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. "She had a mild arrhythmia episode, but her vitals have leveled out. The doctor wants to run additional tests tomorrow to rule out anything more serious, but for tonight, she's resting comfortably. Can I see her?" "Briefly, she's sedated, but you can sit with her." Emily nodded, blinking back tears she hadn't realized were building, and turned to find Victor standing a respectful distance away, watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something quieter, more human, stripped of the calculation that had defined every moment since she'd met him. "Go," he said. "Sit with her. I'll wait." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Victor said. "I'm choosing to. There's a difference, remember?" Emily managed a small, exhausted smile and followed the nurse down the hallway, leaving Victor standing in a hospital waiting room that couldn't have felt further from the world he usually moved through. A world of shipping contracts and private dining rooms, and men who spoke in careful half-truths. She sat beside her mother's bed for almost 20 minutes, holding her frail hand, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor, letting herself feel, just for a moment, like an ordinary daughter worried about an ordinary emergency, instead of a woman who had just uncovered a murder plot and agreed to become a Mafia boss's secret translator in the same night. Her mother's eyes fluttered open briefly, hazy with sedation. "Emily? I'm here, Mom. I'm right here. You look—" Her mother's voice was faint, slurred with medication. "You look like something happened tonight." Emily let out a shaky laugh despite herself. "You have no idea." "Good thing or bad thing?" Emily thought about it, really thought about it, for the first time since she'd whispered those 4 words across a dinner table hours earlier. She thought about the fear, the danger, the impossible position she'd put herself in, and she thought about the alternative, staying silent, going home, letting a man die because it wasn't her business, and carrying that silence for the rest of her life, the way she'd carried the memory of the old man in Berlin. "I think it's a good thing," she said quietly. "I think I did something that mattered tonight." Her mother's eyes drifted closed again, a faint smile on her lips. "That's my girl." Emily sat with her another few minutes until the sedation pulled her mother fully under, then rose quietly, pressing a kiss to her forehead, and stepped back out into the hallway where Victor was waiting exactly where she'd left him, his phone in his hand, his expression tight with something that looked like restrained urgency. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Daniel just texted," Victor said, turning the phone toward her. "He wants to reschedule tomorrow's follow-up meeting with Brandt's people. Says there's been a change of plans on their end." Emily's blood went cold. "What kind of change?" "He says they want to move the signing to a different location, somewhere more private." Victor's thumb hovered over the screen, jaw tight. "A warehouse near the harbor. Says it's for security reasons, given tonight's little incident with the wine." "That's not a coincidence." "No," Victor said grimly. "It's not." Emily felt the fragile relief of the last 20 minutes evaporate instantly, replaced by the same cold dread that had gripped her the moment she first heard Brandt say the word removed. Whatever the Germans had been planning before tonight, her interference hadn't stopped it. It had only made them more careful, more determined to finish the job somewhere far from witnesses, far from spilled wine and inconvenient waitresses who understood too much German for their own good. "When?" she asked. Victor looked up from the phone, his eyes meeting hers with a gravity that made her stomach twist. "Tomorrow night." "That's not enough time to figure out what's really going on." "No," Victor agreed, "it's not. Which means we don't have the luxury of being careful anymore. We go in tomorrow night, or we lose whatever window we still have to stop this before it happens." Emily's mind raced through everything that could go wrong. A warehouse, presumably empty, presumably far from any help. Presumably exactly the kind of place men chose when they wanted no witnesses and no interruptions. She thought about snipers, about ambushes, about the particular kind of silence that fell over a place built for exactly one purpose. "And you still want me there," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I need you there," Victor said. "Without you in that room, I'm walking in blind, trusting a man who's already proven he'll let me die rather than tell me the truth. With you there, at least I know what's actually being said." Emily thought about her mother, sedated and vulnerable just down the hallway. She thought about the fragile promise Victor had made, medical bills covered, a debt repaid, and how quickly that promise would mean nothing if she didn't survive long enough to see it fulfilled. "Okay," she said again, the same word she'd used hours earlier at that restaurant table, except this time it carried infinitely more weight. "I'm in, but I need something from you too. Name it. If something goes wrong tomorrow night, if this doesn't go the way you're planning, I need to know my mother's taken care of, no matter what happens to me." Victor's expression didn't waver, didn't soften into false comfort or empty reassurance. He simply nodded once, the gesture of a man making a promise he intended to keep regardless of cost. "You have my word. Whatever happens to either of us tomorrow, she's protected." It wasn't much. It wasn't a guarantee that either of them would walk out of that warehouse alive. But it was something solid to hold on to in a night that had stripped away every certainty Emily thought she'd had. And right now, that would have to be enough. Outside the hospital windows, the rain had finally started to ease, but neither of them noticed. They were already thinking ahead, already bracing for whatever waited for them inside a warehouse near the harbor, where the men who wanted Victor Moretti dead were about to get a second chance to finish what they'd started. And this time, they wouldn't be caught off guard by a spilled bottle of wine. The next morning arrived with a phone call that shattered whatever fragile calm the last few hours had bought them. Emily was still in the hospital chair, stiff-necked and exhausted, when her new phone, the one Victor's man had pressed into her hand before dawn with the words, "You'll need this now," buzzed against her palm. "We pulled the Munich recording," Victor said. No greeting, no preamble. "I need you to listen to something." "Now? I haven't even slept." "Now," Victor said, and something in his voice told her this wasn't a request she could push back against. 20 minutes later, Emily sat across from Victor in a private office 2 floors above a legitimate shipping company that served, she was beginning to understand, as a kind of front for a great many things that were not legitimate at all. A laptop sat open on the desk between them, and beside it stood a man Emily hadn't met yet. Older, silent, watchful, introduced only as Sal. "Play it," Victor said. Sal tapped a key. The recording crackled to life. Daniel's voice, warm and confident, translating a German businessman's words from 2 months earlier in a room in Munich. Emily leaned forward, closing her eyes, letting the language wash over her the way it had at the restaurant, filtering every syllable for the gap between what was said and what was repeated back. It didn't take long. "There," she said, holding up a hand. "Rewind 10 seconds." Sal complied. The German voice spoke again, quick, casual, clearly not meant to carry weight. Daniel's translation followed a beat later, smooth as ever. "That's wrong," Emily said. "He just told the room the German investor said shipping insurance would be finalized within 30 days. What the man actually said was that insurance wouldn't be necessary because the cargo wouldn't officially exist on any manifest." Victor's face went very still. "Say that again." "The cargo won't be on the books. That's not insurance language, Victor. That's smuggling language." Sal exhaled slowly through his nose, the closest thing to a reaction the silent man seemed capable of. Victor said nothing for a long moment, staring at the frozen laptop screen like it had personally betrayed him, which, in a way, it had. 2 months, he said finally. "He's been running this for 2 months, right under my nose, and I signed off on shipment schedules based on a lie he handed me across a conference table like it was nothing." "You didn't know," Emily said. "That's not the point." Victor's voice had gone flat, dangerous in its stillness. "The point is, I trusted the wrong voice in the room for 2 months, and I have no idea how deep it goes. How many other conversations, how many other contracts, how many other lies dressed up as translations." Emily watched him carefully, the way his hands had curled into loose fists on the desk, the way his jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter he couldn't spit out. She understood in that moment that this wasn't only about danger anymore. This was about a friendship. 6 years of trust, dissolving in real time into something that looked a lot like grief. "We need to know why," she said quietly. "Not just what he's doing, why he's doing it. Does it matter?" "It might. If someone's paying him, that's one kind of problem. If someone's threatening him, that's a very different kind of problem. And a different kind of enemy." Victor looked up at her, something calculating sliding back into place behind his eyes, the grief folding itself neatly away where it wouldn't interfere with what needed to happen next. "You think like someone who spent a lot of time figuring out why people do the things they do." "I think like someone who grew up broke," Emily said simply. "You learn fast that most people aren't cruel for no reason. They're scared or desperate or backed into a corner. Doesn't make what they do right. Just means the story's usually more complicated than it looks from the outside." Sal glanced at Victor, an unspoken question passing between two men who had clearly worked together long enough to communicate without words. Victor gave a small nod. "Pull everything on Daniel," Victor said. "Financials, phone records, family. I want to know if someone's paying him or squeezing him, and I want to know before tonight." Sal left without a word, and the office fell into a heavy silence that Emily didn't know how to fill. She glanced at the clock on the wall, barely past 9 in the morning, and already the day felt like it had lasted a week. "You should sleep," Victor said, watching her rub her eyes. "You look like you're about to fall out of that chair." "I can't sleep, not with tonight hanging over everything." "You'll be no use to me tonight if you're running on nothing." Victor stood, walked to a small side cabinet, and pulled out a folded set of clothes Emily hadn't noticed sitting there. Dark, tailored, nothing like the apron and uniform she'd worn the night before. "Change. Rest for a few hours. Someone will wake you when it's time to prepare." Emily fingered the fabric of the jacket he'd handed her, some part of her still waiting for this whole night to reveal itself as an elaborate fever dream brought on by too many double shifts. "What exactly am I supposed to be tonight, at the warehouse?" "My assistant," Victor said. "Someone new. Someone the Germans have no reason to recognize or question. You stand near me, you say nothing unless I ask, and you listen to every word in that room like your life depends on it, because it does. And if they recognize me from the restaurant, they won't." Victor's eyes moved over her, assessing, already picturing the transformation. Last night you were a waitress in an apron with her hair pulled back, standing in the shadows pouring wine. Tonight you'll be standing beside me in a $5,000 suit, and men like Brandt don't actually look at the people around powerful men. They look at the power. That's the mistake they made with you once already, and it's the mistake they'll make again. Emily thought about that. About a lifetime of being looked past, dismissed, treated as background noise in rooms full of people who mattered, and understood with a strange, cold clarity that Victor wasn't just describing a disguise. He was describing the exact thing that had made her useful in the first place. Her invisibility wasn't a weakness tonight. It was a weapon. "Okay," she said. "Show me where to change." Ciao. By early afternoon, Emily was sitting in a car again, though this one felt different from the black sedan of the night before. Sleeker, quieter, driven by a man who didn't speak a single word the entire ride. She wore the dark tailored suit Victor had given her hair pinned back in a style she'd never worn before, and staring at her own reflection in the tinted window, she barely recognized the woman looking back. Sal met them at a nondescript building a few blocks from the harbor, his expression grim in a way that made Emily's stomach tighten before he even opened his mouth. "Found something," he said, sliding a folder across the table toward Victor. "On Daniel." Victor opened it without a word. Emily watched his face as he read, watched the muscles in his jaw tighten and release, like he was absorbing blows he couldn't visibly react to. "His sister," Victor said finally quietly. "She's in Munich, married a local businessman 3 years ago." "Keep reading," Sal said. Victor flipped the page, and whatever he found there made him go very still. He slid the folder toward Emily without a word, and she scanned the contents quickly. Bank statements, a series of wire transfers, and beneath them, a photograph that made her blood run cold. A woman, clearly frightened, clearly being watched, standing outside what looked like an apartment building with 2 men positioned at a distance that was too deliberate to be coincidence. "They have his sister," Emily said softly. "Brandt's people," Sal confirmed. "Not officially connected to him on paper, but the money trail leads back to a shell company we've linked to his operation before. Best guess, they leaned on Daniel through his sister months ago. Told him to feed you selective translations, or she disappears." Victor closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, Emily saw something different behind them. Not less anger, but anger redirected, refocused, aimed now at Brandt instead of the man he'd trusted for 6 years. "He didn't betray me," Victor said quietly. "He was forced to." "Does that change what happens tonight?" Sal asked, his voice carefully neutral. Victor was silent for a long moment, staring down at the photograph of a frightened woman standing outside her own apartment, watched by men who would use her life as leverage against her brother without a second thought. "It changes everything," Victor said finally. "It means I'm not just walking into that warehouse to save my own life tonight. I'm walking in to end whatever hold these people have over everyone connected to me, Daniel, his sister, and God knows who else they've already got their hooks into." Emily felt something shift in the room, a decision crystallizing that hadn't fully existed a moment before. This was no longer only about survival. It had become something closer to a rescue. For a man who'd betrayed his boss not out of greed, but out of the same desperate love for family that had driven Emily to keep working double shifts to pay for her mother's care. "Does Daniel know you know?" she asked. "Not yet," Victor said, "and he can't. Not until we're inside that warehouse tonight on our terms with everything ready. If he panics before then, he might do something that gets his sister killed before we can move on her protection." "You're going to protect her," Emily said, not quite a question, though she already suspected the answer. "I already sent people to Munich," Victor said, discreetly. "If everything goes the way it needs to tonight, Daniel's sister will be somewhere safe before Brandt's people even realize what's happening." Emily looked at him for a long moment. This man the city whispered about, in tones reserved for monsters, quietly rearranging pieces on a board most people would never see, protecting a woman in another country while preparing to walk into a trap set specifically to kill him. She thought about how easy it would have been to write him off entirely the moment she'd learned his name last night. She was beginning to understand that almost nothing about him was as simple as his reputation suggested. "What do you need from me tonight?" she asked. Victor's expression sharpened back into the focused, controlled intensity she'd first seen in that private dining room. "I need you close to me the entire time. I need you translating everything in real time, without hesitation, without pausing to soften anything. If they say something that means danger, I need to know instantly, not after I've already reacted to whatever Daniel decides to tell me instead." "And if Daniel notices I understand German?" "He won't be paying attention to you," Victor said. "He'll be paying attention to surviving the night himself, same as the rest of us. Every man in that room tonight is going to be focused on his own piece of the puzzle. Your job is to see the whole board while everyone else is staring at their own square." Sal cleared his throat. "There's something else you should know before tonight." Victor looked up. "What?" "We ran surveillance on the warehouse this afternoon. It's not just Brandt and Klaus showing up tonight." Sal's voice had dropped lower, careful, the way a man speaks when he's about to deliver news that changes the entire shape of a plan. "We spotted movement on the upper catwalks, positioning. 2 men, maybe 3, carrying equipment consistent with rifles." The room went cold. "Snipers," Victor said quietly. "That's our read," Sal confirmed. "They're not planning a conversation tonight, Victor. They're planning an execution, the meeting, the contract, all of it. That's just theater to get you standing in the right spot." Emily felt her pulse spike, the reality of what they were walking into finally crystallizing into something sharper than fear, something closer to dread. Last night had been dangerous in an abstract way, a threat uncovered before it could fully form. Tonight was different. Tonight, the trap was already built, already loaded, already waiting for them to walk directly into it. "Then we don't walk in blind," Victor said, his voice steady, despite everything Sal had just told him. "We need a signal, something simple, something that won't look suspicious if anyone's watching, something Emily can use the instant she hears anything that tells us the trap is closing." "A phrase?" Emily asked. "Something I say?" "Too risky," Sal said. "If they're watching that closely, spoken words draw attention. You need something silent, something that looks like an accident." Victor was quiet for a moment, turning something over in his mind, and then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a simple silver pen, the same one, Emily realized with a jolt, that he'd been holding the night before, the one his hand had tightened around the instant she'd whispered the truth to him. "This," he said, setting it down on the table between them. "You'll carry it in your jacket pocket tonight. If you hear anything that tells us this is about to turn violent, any mention of timing, positioning, a signal of their own, you drop it. On the floor, in front of me, like an accident. I'll know exactly what it means, and I'll move the moment I hear it hit the ground." Emily picked up the pen, turning it over in her fingers, feeling the absurd, terrifying weight of it. An entire plan, an entire life, possibly several lives, resting on whether or not she could drop a pen at exactly the right second in a room full of men who wanted Victor Moretti dead. "What happens after I drop it?" she asked. "What happens next?" "Then you get down," Victor said, his voice suddenly, fiercely direct in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "Immediately. No hesitation, no looking around to see what's happening. The second that pen hits the floor, you drop with it, and you stay down until someone tells you it's safe to move. Do you understand me?" Emily nodded, though her throat had gone too tight to speak. "Say it back to me," Victor pressed. "I need to know you understand." "Pen drops, I drop," Emily managed. "No hesitation." "Good." Victor studied her for a long moment, something almost apologetic flickering across his usually unreadable face. "I know this isn't what you signed up for. 24 hours ago you were pouring wine for strangers, worrying about rent. I don't have the luxury of easing you into this world slowly. I need you sharp tonight, and I need you scared enough to be careful, but not so scared you freeze." "I won't freeze," Emily said, and was surprised to find she meant it. "I believe you," Victor said. "Last night, in that dining room, with security reaching for weapons and half the room panicking around you, you didn't freeze then. You made a choice, fast, under pressure, and it saved my life. I'm betting everything tonight on the idea that you'll do it again." The weight of that trust, earned in less than 24 hours, resting now on the shoulders of a woman who 12 hours earlier had been worried about making rent, settled over Emily like a second skin. She thought of her mother, asleep in a hospital bed across the city, unaware that her daughter's next few hours would determine whether she came home to explain any of this at all. "Let's go over it again," she said. "Everything, every word you think they might say tonight, every scenario. I want to know exactly what I'm listening for." Victor allowed himself the faintest ghost of a smile. "Now you're thinking like someone who survives." The hours that followed blurred together in a haze of preparation, maps of the warehouse spread across a table, positions marked and remarked, Sal briefing a small team of men who would be stationed outside, out of sight, ready to move the instant things went wrong. Emily sat through all of it, absorbing details, memorizing exits, memorizing the specific phrases in German that would mean danger was no longer theoretical. By the time evening fell, her hands had stopped shaking, replaced by a strange, focused calm that frightened her more than the fear had. She wondered if this was what Victor felt all the time, this cold clarity that let a person function normally while standing at the edge of catastrophe. Daniel arrived at the meeting point an hour before the warehouse gathering, and Emily watched him from a distance, studying him with new eyes, now that she understood the truth behind his betrayal. He looked exhausted, hollowed out, a man carrying a weight that had nothing to do with business deals and everything to do with a sister half a world away, watched by strangers who would hurt her without hesitation if he stepped out of line. "How are you holding up?" Victor asked him, his voice perfectly normal, betraying nothing of what he now knew. "Fine," Daniel said, too quickly, his eyes flicking briefly toward Emily before returning to Victor. "Who's this?" "New assistant," Victor said smoothly. "Emily. She'll be with us tonight." Daniel's gaze lingered on her for half a second too long, and Emily felt her pulse jump, certain for one terrifying moment that he recognized her from the restaurant. But whatever flicker of recognition passed through his eyes seemed to resolve itself into nothing more than mild curiosity, the kind any new face might draw in a room full of familiar ones. "Nice to meet you," he said, extending a hand. "Likewise," Emily said, keeping her voice light, forcing every instinct screaming inside her to stay perfectly, deceptively calm. His hand was cold. His grip lingered a half-second longer than necessary, and Emily wondered, with a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, whether some part of him already suspected that the woman shaking his hand was the reason his careful lies had started to unravel. "We should head over," Daniel said, checking his watch, his composure sliding back into place like a mask settling over his features. "Brant doesn't like to be kept waiting." "No," Victor said, his eyes briefly meeting Emily's over Daniel's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "I imagine he doesn't." They rode to the warehouse in near silence, Daniel checking his phone twice, his knee bouncing with a nervous energy he seemed to be fighting hard to suppress. Emily sat across from him, the silver pen tucked carefully into her jacket pocket, her every sense tuned to the smallest shift in his behavior. "You all right, Daniel?" Victor asked, casual, almost gentle. "Just tired," Daniel said. "Big deal. Lot riding on tonight." "More than you know," Victor said quietly, and something in his tone made Daniel look up sharply, searching Victor's face for a meaning he couldn't quite place. Victor gave him nothing. No accusation, no warmth, just the same unreadable calm he'd carried since the moment Emily first saw him step into that private dining room. The car slowed. Emily felt her stomach drop as the warehouse came into view, vast, quiet, lit only by a handful of exterior lights that did little to push back the darkness pooling in every corner. Somewhere above, in the shadows of the catwalk Sal had described, men were already in position, waiting for the signal that would end Victor Moretti's life. Emily's fingers brushed the pen in her pocket as she stepped out of the car, and she made herself breathe slowly, evenly, the way Victor had coached her to do during the long hours of preparation. You don't freeze, you listen, you wait. Inside, the warehouse felt larger than she'd imagined, the space swallowing sound in strange, echoing ways that made every footstep feel too loud. Brandt was already waiting near a long metal table set up in the center of the open floor, Klaus beside him, both men smiling with the same practiced warmth they'd shown the night before. "Herr Moretti," Brandt said, extending a hand. "Thank you for accommodating the change of venue. Security concerns, you understand." Daniel translated smoothly, and Emily listened, cataloging every word, waiting for the first crack in the polished surface of the conversation. "Of course," Victor said through Daniel's translation, his own voice steady, betraying nothing. "Whatever makes everyone comfortable." Brandt's eyes moved briefly toward Emily, assessing, dismissive, exactly the reaction Victor had predicted. She was furniture to him, a new assistant, unremarkable, unworthy of a second glance. She held perfectly still under his gaze, grateful, for the first time in her life, for the particular kind of invisibility that came with being underestimated. The negotiation began again, circling familiar ground. Shipping terms, timelines, the same contract language from the night before, now presented with fresh signatures required given the change of location. Emily listened to every word Daniel translated, comparing it silently against what she heard in German, searching for the gaps. For several minutes, there were none. The conversation ran clean, honest, almost disappointingly ordinary, given everything they'd braced for. Then Klaus leaned toward Brandt and murmured something low, meant only for his associate's ears. 15 minutes, he said in German. "Once he's seated at the table for the signing, that's our window." Emily's entire body went rigid. She kept her face perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in front of her, giving nothing away, even as her pulse roared in her ears. "Understood," Brandt murmured back, barely audible. "Make sure the men upstairs have clean sight lines the moment he sits." There it was. Confirmation, spoken casually, carelessly, by men who had no idea the quiet assistant standing 3 feet away understood every syllable. Daniel, meanwhile, continued translating the surface conversation. Polite, procedural, utterly disconnected from the death sentence being arranged in real time beside him. Emily understood, watching him work, that he was performing exactly the role he'd been forced into, keeping Victor calm, keeping him seated, keeping him exactly where the men above needed him to be. She needed to warn Victor, but not yet. Not until she understood the full shape of the trap, not until she knew precisely how much time they had before 15 minutes became 14, became 10, became none at all. "Shall we review the final terms?" Brandt asked, gesturing toward the table, toward the chairs positioned with a precision Emily now understood wasn't accidental at all. "Of course," Victor said, and began to move toward the table. Emily's heart slammed against her ribs. This was it, the moment Victor would sit exactly where the men above wanted him, the 15-minute countdown already ticking toward its inevitable violent conclusion. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the cold metal of the pen, and felt the full, impossible weight of the decision resting entirely on her timing. Too soon, and she risked triggering chaos before they understood the full danger. Too late, and there might be no chance to trigger anything at all. Victor lowered himself into the chair Brandt had gestured toward, his expression calm, unreadable, betraying nothing of the fact that he was, at this very moment, sitting in the exact center of a kill zone built specifically for him. Daniel took his own seat beside him, his hands trembling almost imperceptibly as he reached for the folder of contracts. Brandt smiled, warm and patient, the smile of a man who believed, with absolute confidence, that within minutes this problem would be permanently solved. Emily's fingers tightened around the pen in her pocket, her whole body coiled with a fear so sharp it felt almost like clarity. And somewhere above them, in the shadows along the catwalks, she knew without seeing them that the men Sal had spotted that afternoon were already raising their rifles, already finding their angle, already counting down the same 15 minutes that was now counting down inside her own chest, like a second heartbeat she couldn't slow. 15 minutes. Emily repeated the number in her head like a countdown clock. Nobody else in the room could hear, the pen cold and heavy in her pocket, her pulse hammering so hard she was certain Brandt would notice it in the pulse at her throat. "Shall we begin with the shipping manifests?" Brandt asked, sliding a folder across the table toward Victor, his voice warm, unhurried, the voice of a man who believed he had all the time in the world. Daniel translated, his hands trembling as he opened his own copy of the folder, and Emily watched him with new eyes now. Not the smooth, confident translator from the night before, but a man barely holding himself together, a man who knew exactly what those 15 minutes meant and had no way to stop the clock without destroying everything he was trying to protect. "Page 3, Victor said, his voice perfectly level. "Walk me through the terminal allocations again." Daniel flipped pages with fingers that weren't quite steady, and Emily caught it. A small hesitation, a half-second pause before he began speaking, like a man choosing his next words with more care than usual. "Tell him the terminal allocations remain unchanged from the draft," Brandt said in German, watching Victor's face carefully. Then, almost as an afterthought, quieter, meant only for Klaus. "Confirm the positions are locked." Klaus rose from his seat. "Excuse me a moment," he said in accented English, already moving toward a side door near the edge of the warehouse floor. "I need to check on our equipment." Emily's stomach dropped. Our equipment. She knew exactly what that meant, and judging by the barely perceptible tightening around Victor's eyes, so did he, though neither of them so much as glanced at each other. 14 minutes. "Of course," Victor said smoothly, as if a man excusing himself to check on hidden snipers was the most ordinary thing in the world. "Take your time." Klaus disappeared through the side door, and Emily used the brief interruption to scan the warehouse floor without moving her head, cataloging exits, distances, the position of Victor's own men stationed just outside, too far to help if things went wrong in the next few seconds, close enough to matter once chaos actually broke loose. Brandt smiled at Victor across the table, filling the silence with pleasantries about the weather, about New York, about how much he'd enjoyed the city during his visit. Daniel translated each word with the same practiced warmth he always used, but Emily noticed something new in his voice now. A strain underneath the smoothness, like a wire pulled almost to its breaking point. Klaus returned 4 minutes later, resuming his seat with a small nod toward Brandt that needed no translation. Emily read it anyway, in the tightening of Brandt's shoulders, in the way his smile sharpened just slightly at the edges. Locked in. Whatever that nod meant, it meant the men above them were ready. 10 minutes. "Let's move to the signature page," Brandt said, and Daniel's translation came out a half-beat too fast this time, like a man trying to outrun his own dread. Victor reached for the contract, flipping through pages with deliberate slowness, buying time Emily wasn't sure he even realized he needed. She watched his hand hover near the final page, near the empty line waiting for his signature, and understood with sick clarity that once he signed, Brandt's people would have no reason to wait even a second longer than necessary to finish what they'd come to do. "Before I sign," Victor said, and something in his tone made Daniel look up sharply, "I want to walk through the insurance terms one more time. Page 7. Brandt's smile didn't waver, but Emily caught the flicker of impatience behind it, the almost imperceptible tightening of a man whose careful plan was being nudged, however slightly, off its rhythm. "Of course," Brandt said through Daniel. "Whatever puts your mind at ease." 9 minutes. Daniel began reading through the insurance clause, his voice steady on the surface, but Emily noticed his eyes kept flicking toward the side door Klaus had disappeared through earlier, like a man watching a fuse burn down and unable to look away. She needed more information. She needed to know exactly how this was supposed to happen. A single signal, a coordinated strike, something that would give her and Victor even a few extra seconds of warning beyond the vague countdown Klaus had murmured earlier. Her chance came sooner than she expected. Brandt's phone buzzed against the table, and he glanced down at it, his expression flickering with something that looked almost like irritation. He murmured something to Klaus in German, too quiet for Emily to catch every word, but she caught enough. "Change of plan," Brandt said. "Moving it up. 5 minutes, not 15. Emily's blood turned to ice. 5 minutes. Not 15. Whatever had prompted the change, a call, a message, some piece of information Emily wasn't privy to. The timeline had just been cut by 2/3, and there was no way to tell Victor without giving everything away. She needed to move now, but not too soon. not before she understood exactly what moving it up meant in practice. Klaus's phone buzzed as well, and he read something on the screen, his jaw tightening. He glanced toward Brant, gave the smallest nod, and Emily understood, with dawning horror, that the men above them had already begun repositioning, already begun preparing to act far sooner than anyone at this table besides Brant and Klaus realized. "Is everything all right?" Victor asked, his voice carrying just enough polite curiosity to sound natural, though Emily suspected he'd caught the shift in the room's energy just as clearly as she had. Daniel translated the question, and Brant waved a hand dismissively. "Just business elsewhere," he said through Daniel. "Nothing that concerns us here. Please continue with the insurance clause." Daniel's voice cracked slightly as he resumed reading, and Emily realized, watching him, that he was fighting something internal, some battle between the fear that kept him translating exactly what he was told to translate, and something else, something that looked almost like the beginning of resistance. 4 minutes. "Daniel," Victor said suddenly, cutting into the middle of a sentence about liability coverage. "You've been off all day. Everything all right?" The question landed like a small earthquake. Daniel's hands stilled completely, the folder trembling almost imperceptibly in his grip. "I'm fine," Daniel said, too fast, his voice thin. "Just tired. Long week." "You sure?" Victor pressed, gently, almost kindly, and Emily understood exactly what he was doing. Testing something, probing at the seams of a man he now knew was carrying a secret too heavy to hold much longer. Daniel's eyes flicked toward Emily, just for a fraction of a second, something desperate and searching in his expression, like a man drowning and reaching blindly for anything solid. Emily kept her face perfectly still, giving him nothing, though her heart ached with a complicated pity she hadn't expected to feel for a man who had, only a day earlier, nearly gotten Victor Moretti killed with his silence. "I'm sure," Daniel said finally, dropping his eyes back to the contract. "Should we continue?" 3 minutes. Emily's fingers found the pen in her pocket, gripping it so tightly the metal edges bit into her palm. She needed to time this exactly right. Too soon, and she risked triggering an ambush before Victor's own men outside were positioned to respond. Too late, and there might be nothing left to respond to. Brant reached across the table, sliding the contract's final page directly in front of Victor. "Shall we finish this then?" he said through Daniel, his smile widening into something that looked, to Emily's newly attuned senses, almost hungry. Victor picked up his own pen, his real pen, not the one Emily carried, and uncapped it slowly, deliberately, his eyes flicking once, briefly, almost imperceptibly toward Emily. 2 minutes. Emily's mind raced, cataloging every word Brant and Klaus had exchanged in the last several minutes, searching for the exact moment the trap would spring. She thought about the men on the catwalks above, rifles raised, waiting for a single clear shot the instant Victor's guard dropped low enough for the signing to feel final. She thought about her mother, asleep in a hospital bed, unaware that her daughter's next 60 seconds might determine whether she ever came home. She thought about the old man in Berlin, and the silence she had promised herself she would never carry again. Victor's pen touched the paper. Now. Emily let the silver pen slip from her fingers. It hit the concrete floor with a sound far louder than it had any right to be, a sharp metallic clatter that seemed to echo through the entire warehouse. And in the half-second of confused silence that followed, Emily dropped. She hit the ground hard, elbows scraping against concrete, and in the same instant, Victor moved. Not toward the table, not toward Brant, but sideways out of his chair, his body already twisting away from the exact spot the men above had spent the last hour calculating. The first shot cracked through the warehouse a heartbeat later, splintering the wooden chair Victor had been sitting in only a fraction of a second earlier. Chaos detonated around them. Brant was on his feet instantly, shouting something in German that Emily couldn't process fast enough to translate, his own hand disappearing beneath his jacket. Klaus was already moving toward the side door, drawing a weapon of his own. His earlier calm shattered into something sharp and violent. "Down! Stay down!" Victor's voice cut through the noise, and Emily flattened herself further against the cold concrete, her hands over her head, her heart slamming so hard against her ribs it felt like it might crack them. More gunfire erupted, this time from outside the warehouse, and Emily recognized, through the ringing panic in her ears, the sound of Victor's men responding. Sal's team, positioned exactly where they'd promised to be, moving in the instant the pen hit the floor. A bullet tore through the metal table above her, sending sparks and splintered wood raining down. Emily pressed herself flatter, every instinct screaming at her to run, to move, to do anything except lie helpless on an open floor while bullets tore through the space above her. Then a hand closed around her arm, hauling her sideways with surprising strength, and Emily found herself pulled behind an overturned steel cabinet, pressed against Victor's side, both of them breathing hard, hearts pounding in a shared, desperate rhythm. "You're okay," Victor said, his voice tight but controlled, checking her over with quick, efficient eyes. "You're okay. Stay down. Stay close." "Daniel!" Emily gasped, twisting to look past the edge of the cabinet. "Where's Daniel?" Across the warehouse floor, Daniel Reeves was crouched behind an overturned chair, his face white with terror, his eyes darting frantically between the chaos around him and the side door Klaus had disappeared through moments earlier. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was watching, calculating, some internal battle playing out across his face that Emily couldn't fully read from this distance. Another burst of gunfire erupted, closer this time, and Emily flinched hard against Victor's side. Somewhere above them, one of the men on the catwalk shouted something in German, a warning, a curse, Emily couldn't tell which. And then a heavy weight crashed down onto the warehouse floor a dozen feet away, and Emily realized with a lurch of nausea that one of the shooters had just fallen or been shot down from the catwalk itself. "Sal's team is inside," Victor said, more to himself than to her, tracking the rhythm of the gunfire with the ear of a man who had heard far too much of it in his life to be fooled by chaos alone. "They're clearing the upper level." "What about Brandt?" Victor's eyes swept the warehouse floor, and Emily followed his gaze to where Brandt had taken cover behind a stack of shipping crates, his weapon drawn, his earlier polished composure completely gone, replaced by the raw animal panic of a man whose careful plan had collapsed in less than 30 seconds. "He's trapped," Victor said grimly. "He didn't plan for this. He planned for a clean kill, not a fight." A new voice cut through the chaos, Klaus shouting something in German from near the side door, and Emily's blood ran cold as she translated it instantly in her head. "Fall back! Fall back! We're compromised! Get to the vehicles!" "They're retreating," Emily said quickly. "Klaus is telling everyone to fall back to the vehicles." Victor's jaw tightened. "Not on my watch." He rose slightly from behind the cabinet, just enough to gesture sharply toward two of his men who had just breached the warehouse's main entrance, weapons raised, moving with the disciplined efficiency of men who had trained for exactly this kind of moment. Victor's hand signals were quick, precise, and the men adjusted their positions instantly, cutting off the path toward the side door where Klaus had been shouting orders. The gunfire began to thin, replaced by shouted commands, the scrape of boots against concrete, the particular tense quiet that follows violence when neither side is entirely sure it's over yet. "Moretti!" Brandt's voice rang out from behind the shipping crates, in English now, stripped of every trace of the polished diplomat from moments earlier. "This doesn't have to go further. We can still talk." "You had your chance to talk," Victor called back, his voice carrying an edge Emily hadn't heard from him before, something colder, harder, forged from 6 years of misplaced trust and a single betrayed friendship he was only now beginning to fully understand. "You chose bullets instead." A long, tense silence stretched across the warehouse floor, broken only by the distant echo of Sal's men finishing whatever was happening on the catwalks above. Emily's heart hadn't slowed at all, still hammering against her ribs, her hands pressed flat against the cold concrete, as if the floor itself might offer some kind of protection. "Emily," Victor's voice was quiet now, urgent. "I need you to listen for anything else they say. Anything. We need to know if there are more of them, more weapons, anything we haven't accounted for." Emily nodded, straining to hear past the ringing in her ears, past the pounding of her own pulse, focusing every ounce of attention on the muffled German voices, still coming from behind the shipping crates. He's got men everywhere, Klaus was saying, his voice tight with panic. We need to get out, now, before— We can't leave without confirmation, Brandt snapped back. If he survives tonight, everything we've built collapses. Everything. They're not planning to run, Emily whispered urgently to Victor. Brandt's saying if you survive tonight, everything they've built collapses. He's not going to give up easily. Victor's expression sharpened, some new understanding clicking into place behind his eyes. Everything they've built, he repeated quietly. This isn't just about tonight. This is about protecting something bigger. Before Emily could respond, a fresh burst of gunfire erupted from near the shipping crates. Brandt, apparently deciding that surrender was worse than the fight, opening fire toward Victor's men with the desperate energy of a cornered animal. Emily flinched hard, pressing closer against the cabinet, and Victor's arm came around her instinctively, shielding her body with his own even as he shouted orders toward his men. The exchange lasted only seconds, but they felt endless. The sharp crack of gunfire, the shattering of glass somewhere above them, shouted commands in two languages colliding in the chaos. Then, abruptly, silence. "Clear!" one of Victor's men shouted from near the crates. "Brandt's down! Klaus is in custody!" Emily felt the tension drain out of Victor's body in a single long exhale, though his expression didn't fully relax. Not yet, not with so much still unresolved. "Stay here," he told her, rising slowly from behind the cabinet, scanning the warehouse floor with the wary caution of a man who understood that danger rarely announced its final ending clearly. Emily stayed crouched, her whole body trembling now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go, watching as Victor moved cautiously across the warehouse floor toward the shipping crates where Brandt had made his last stand. She saw him crouch beside a figure she couldn't fully see from her position, saw his shoulders tighten, and understood without being told that Brandt hadn't survived the exchange. Klaus, however, had. Two of Victor's men hauled him upright, his hands bound, his face a mask of fury and fear in equal measure, blood trickling from a shallow wound along his temple. "You have no idea what you've just started," Klaus spat, first in German, then, seeing Victor's blank expression, switching to broken English. "This goes higher than Brandt, higher than anyone in this room." "Then you're going to tell me exactly how high," Victor said quietly, his voice carrying a promise that made even Emily's skin crawl from a distance. A commotion near the edge of the warehouse floor pulled everyone's attention. Emily looked up to see Daniel finally emerging from behind the overturned chair he'd been sheltering behind, his face pale, his hands shaking violently as he stared at the scene around him. Brandt's body, Klaus in restraints, Victor standing amid the wreckage of a plan that had nearly killed him. "Victor," Daniel said, his voice cracking, "I need to explain." "Not here," Victor said sharply, cutting him off, though something in his tone wasn't entirely unkind. "Not now." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He seemed to be fighting desperately to hold back. "They have my sister," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush, like a dam finally breaking after months of pressure. "In Munich, they said if I didn't—" "I know," Victor said quietly. Daniel froze, the confession dying on his lips. "You know?" "I've known since this afternoon," Victor said. "I already sent people to protect her, Daniel. She's safe, or she will be within the hour." Daniel's legs seemed to give out beneath him, and he sank onto an overturned crate, his hands covering his face, his shoulders shaking with something between relief and grief. Emily watched from a distance, her own body still trembling from the adrenaline of the last several minutes, and felt an unexpected wave of sympathy for a man who had, in his own desperate way, been trapped just as thoroughly as Victor had been. "Why didn't you come to me?" Victor asked, his voice quieter now, some of the coldness fading into something closer to genuine hurt. 6 years, Daniel. Why didn't you just tell me?" "Because they showed me pictures," Daniel said, his voice breaking completely now. Pictures of her outside her apartment. Pictures of her daughter walking home from school. They didn't have to say what would happen. I understood exactly what they meant, and I was terrified that if I told you, they'd hurt her before you could do anything to stop it. And instead you nearly got me killed." "I know," Daniel said, his voice raw. "I know, and I hated myself every single day for it. I tried to slow things down where I could. I tried to leave gaps they wouldn't notice, hoping you'd catch something, hoping someone would catch something before it was too late. His voice cracked entirely. I didn't know what else to do. Emily thought about the small hesitations she'd noticed in his translations, the pauses that felt too deliberate to be accidental, and understood with a jolt that some part of what she'd witnessed hadn't been pure betrayal at all. It had been a man walking an impossible tightrope, trying to protect two people he loved without the tools or the courage to do either one fully. Victor was quiet for a long moment, studying Daniel with an expression Emily couldn't quite read. Something caught between fury and something gentler, something that understood, on some fundamental level, exactly what it meant to be forced into an impossible choice. You should have trusted me, Victor said finally. I would have protected her the moment you told me. Instead, I nearly died because you were too afraid to ask for help. I know, Daniel whispered again, and it seemed to be the only thing left in him to say. Klaus, still restrained a few feet away, let out a bitter laugh. Touching, he sneered. But it changes nothing. You think this ends because Brandt's dead and you caught your translator crying? This is bigger than one shipment, Moretti, bigger than one warehouse. Victor turned toward him slowly, and Emily saw something settle into his expression. Not anger, not exactly, but a cold, focused resolve that made even Klaus's defiant posture waver slightly. Then you're going to tell me everything, Victor said quietly. Every name, every connection, every piece of whatever it is you and Brandt were protecting badly enough to try to have me killed for it. I'm not telling you anything. You will, Victor said, with a certainty that left no room for argument. Because right now, the only thing standing between you and every enemy you've made tonight is me. Brandt's dead. His plan failed. Whoever's above him in this operation is not going to be pleased that you're the one who survived to explain how it all fell apart. You need my protection just as badly as I need your information. So we're going to have a very long conversation, Klaus. And how it goes depends entirely on how cooperative you decide to be. Klaus's bravado flickered, just slightly, and Emily saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. The sudden dawning realization that the men who had ordered tonight's ambush would view his failure and his survival as two very different kinds of liability. Sal approached from across the warehouse floor, his expression grim, a phone pressed to his ear. He ended the call and turned to Victor. Munich team confirms Daniel's sister and her daughter are secure. They're being moved to a safe location as we speak. Daniel let out a broken sound that was half sob, half laugh, relief crashing through him so visibly that Emily's own eyes stung with unexpected emotion. Whatever else had happened tonight, whatever complicated tangle of fear and betrayal had led them all to this moment, at least that much had gone right. Victor turned back to Emily, who was still standing near the overturned cabinet, her legs finally steady enough to hold her weight, though her hands hadn't quite stopped trembling. You did exactly what I needed tonight, he said quietly, his eyes searching her face with something that looked almost like wonder. Twice now you've saved my life in less than 24 hours. I dropped a pen, Emily said, a slightly hysterical laugh bubbling up through the last of her adrenaline. That's it. That's all I did. That's not all you did, Victor said. You heard something nobody else in that room could hear, and you trusted yourself enough to act on it, twice, with everything on the line. That's rarer than you think. Klaus, still restrained nearby, muttered something under his breath in German, something bitter and resigned, and Emily caught just enough of it to feel a fresh chill settle over her. This isn't over. They'll send someone else. She looked up sharply at Victor. He just said this isn't over, that they'll send someone else. Victor's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened, calculating, already 3 steps ahead of whatever came next. Then we'll be ready for whoever they send, he said quietly, because now I know exactly what to listen for and exactly who to trust to help me hear it. Sal moved to escort Klaus toward a waiting vehicle, and the warehouse slowly began to empty of the chaos that had filled it minutes earlier. Victor's men clearing the scene with quiet, practiced efficiency. Daniel still sitting on the overturned crate, drained and shaking, staring at his own hands like he barely recognized them. Emily walked over to him slowly, some instinct pulling her toward the man she'd spent the last 24 hours viewing as the enemy, now understanding him as something far more complicated than that. "Your sister's safe," she said quietly, sitting down beside him. "That's not nothing, Daniel." "I almost got him killed," Daniel said, his voice hollow. "I almost got you killed too. You don't even know me, and I nearly cost you your life." "But you didn't," Emily said, "because in the end, you didn't have to be the one to save him. I heard what you did, leaving gaps, slowing things down where you could. That wasn't nothing either." Daniel looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed, exhausted in a way that went far beyond a single sleepless night. "Why are you being kind to me, after everything?" Emily thought about it for a moment, genuinely considering the question, rather than offering an easy answer. "Because I understand what it's like to be scared for someone you love and not know what to do about it," she said finally. "I don't think that makes what happened okay, but I think it makes it human, and I'd rather understand the whole story than just the part that looks worst from the outside." Across the warehouse, Victor watched the exchange in silence, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and Emily wondered, not for the first time that night, exactly how much more complicated this world was than the simple, frightening reputation that had walked into her restaurant less than 2 days earlier, and how much further this story still had to go before either of them would truly be safe. 3 days passed before Emily allowed herself to believe the danger had actually ended, and even then, the belief came slowly, in small pieces, the way trust always seemed to arrive after a night like the one at the warehouse. She spent the first day at her mother's bedside, watching test results come back clean, watching color return to a face that had looked far too pale in that hospital bed. When the doctor mentioned the additional procedure her mother needed, the one insurance had denied twice already, Emily braced herself for the familiar dread of calculating impossible numbers in her head. "It's already been taken care of," the billing coordinator told her, not looking up from her computer screen. "Paid in full yesterday afternoon. Anonymous donor." Emily didn't need to ask who. She sat with that knowledge for a long moment, feeling something complicated unfold in her chest. Gratitude tangled up with a strange, quiet grief for the woman she'd been just 4 days earlier, the one who thought her biggest problem in life was double shifts and a leaking faucet. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she remembered fondly but couldn't quite return to. Emily? She turned to find her mother watching her from the hospital bed, eyes clearer than they'd been in weeks, studying her daughter's face with the particular sharpness only a mother seemed to possess. "You've been different since that night," her mother said. "The one you never fully explained to me." "It's a long story, Mom." "I have time," her mother said, patting the edge of the bed. "Apparently my medical bills are being handled by someone named Victor. I'd like to know who Victor is before he becomes a bigger part of your life than I already suspect he's about to be." Emily laughed despite herself, surprised by how much lighter it felt than any laugh she'd managed in days. She sat down slowly, and for the first time since the wine had spilled across Daniel Reeves's suit 4 nights earlier, she told the whole story from the beginning. The whispered lie across a dinner table, the pen that had saved a man's life, the warehouse, the gunfire, the 15 minutes that had collapsed into 5 and then into nothing at all. Her mother listened without interrupting, her expression shifting through fear and disbelief, and something that eventually settled into a kind of fierce, quiet pride Emily hadn't expected. "You could have died," her mother said finally. "I know. And you'd do it again." It wasn't a question, but Emily answered it anyway. "Yes," she said. "I think I would." Her mother was quiet for a long moment, studying her daughter with an expression Emily couldn't quite read. "Your father used to say something like that," she said finally. "Before he passed, he used to say the measure of a person isn't what they do when it's easy to be brave. It's what they do when being brave costs them everything and nobody's watching to give them credit for it." "Nobody was watching," Emily said quietly. "I almost didn't do it at all." "But you did," her mother said. "That's the part that matters." Victor called 2 days later, his voice carrying a formality Emily hadn't heard from him since that first terrifying conversation in the restaurant hallway. "I need you to come in," he said. "There's something we need to discuss." The words sent a small jolt of anxiety through her, old instincts rising fast. the fear that this strange, dangerous chapter of her life was about to end as abruptly as it had begun, that Victor had decided the waitress-turned-translator experiment had run its course, and it was time to send her back to her old life with a generous severance and a firm goodbye. She arrived at the same office above the shipping company where she'd first heard the Munich recording and found Victor waiting behind his desk, Sal standing quietly near the window, and, unexpectedly, Daniel seated in one of the chairs across from Victor, looking healthier than he had in the warehouse, though still carrying a heaviness in his posture that Emily suspected might take considerably longer than a few days to fully lift. "Sit," Victor said, gesturing to the empty chair beside Daniel. Emily sat, glancing between the two men, trying to read the temperature of whatever conversation had happened before she arrived. "What's going on?" "Klaus talked," Victor said without preamble. "Extensively, once he understood exactly how much trouble he was in without our protection. What he told us confirmed something I suspected the moment I heard about the second shipment you mentioned that first night." "The one Brandt mentioned in German?" Emily said. "The one Daniel didn't translate." "That one." Victor's expression darkened slightly. Brandt wasn't working alone, and he wasn't working for himself. He was a mid-level piece in something considerably larger, a network moving product through legitimate shipping routes across half a dozen countries. My terminals were valuable to them specifically because nobody would think to look twice at cargo moving through Victor Moretti's shipping lines. I have something of a reputation for running a clean operation, ironically enough. "So this was never really about the contract at all," Emily said slowly, understanding dawning. "The contract was just the door they needed to walk through." "Exactly." Victor leaned back in his chair, something weary settling into his features. "And now that door's been slammed shut, which means whoever sits above Brandt in this network knows their plan failed and knows exactly why." "Which means it's not over," Emily said, echoing the words Klaus had muttered in German back at the warehouse, the ones that had chilled her to the bone even in the middle of all that chaos. "No," Victor agreed. "It's not over, but it's different now. They lost their inside access. They lost Brandt. They lost whatever leverage they thought they had over Daniel." His eyes moved briefly to Daniel, something complicated passing between them. "And they're going to be considerably more careful about how they come at me next time, which buys us time to prepare instead of reacting blind." Daniel shifted in his seat, his hands folded tightly in his lap. "Victor's letting me stay," he said quietly, glancing at Emily like he needed to explain himself, needed her to understand something he hadn't fully worked out how to say to Victor directly. "After everything, he's letting me stay." "On conditions," Victor said, his voice firm but not unkind. "No more secrets, no more silence when something threatens the people you love. If anyone ever comes at your sister again, at anyone in your life, you come to me the same hour it happens, not months later when the damage is already half done." "I understand," Daniel said. "I should have understood that 6 years ago." "You understand it now," Victor said. "That's what matters going forward." Emily watched the exchange with a strange, quiet warmth building in her chest, watching two men rebuild something that had nearly been destroyed by fear and silence, watching trust get stitched back together in real time in a way that felt fragile but genuine. She thought about how easy it would have been for Victor to simply cut Daniel loose, to treat the betrayal as unforgivable regardless of the reasons behind it. That he hadn't. That he'd chosen instead to understand the fuller, more complicated truth, told her something important about the man sitting across from her, something that contradicted almost everything the city whispered about him. "What about me?" Emily asked, because the question had been sitting in her chest since Victor's call 2 days earlier, and she needed to know the answer before she let herself get any more comfortable in this new, strange world. Victor's eyes moved to her, and for a moment, something almost like uncertainty crossed his face, an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not once, not even in the middle of gunfire. "What about you?" he repeated slowly. "Depends entirely on what you want." "Meaning?" "Meaning I made you a promise 4 nights ago, and I intend to keep it regardless of what you decide next. Your mother's medical bills are covered. That debt is paid whether you walk out of this office today and never speak to me again, or whether you stay." He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. "But I'd like you to stay, Emily. Not because I need a translator, though God knows I do, but because in 4 days you've shown me something I don't see very often in this business. You've shown me that you can be trusted with the truth, even when the truth is dangerous, even when it would be easier to look away. Emily, Bapti. Emily's throat tightened. She thought about the restaurant, about Louis and his nervous energy, about the life she'd been living before that private dining room had upended everything she thought she understood about her own limits. She thought about the fear she'd felt crouched behind that overturned cabinet, bullets tearing through the air above her, and she thought, too, about the strange, fierce clarity that had settled over her in that same terrifying moment, the sense that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. What would I actually be doing? She asked. If I stayed. Officially, you'd be my personal assistant, Victor said. Unofficially, you'd be exactly what you were in that warehouse. Someone I trust to hear what's really being said, in any language, in any room, and tell me the truth about it no matter how dangerous that truth turns out to be. That sounds like a very long list of dangerous rooms in my future. It probably is, Victor admitted. I won't pretend otherwise. This isn't a safe world, and I won't insult you by suggesting it is. But it's a world where the truth matters, where courage matters, and where the people in it, the good ones anyway, take care of each other when it counts. I think you've already proven you belong in that category, whether you decide to stay or not. Emily sat with the offer for a long moment, feeling the weight of it settle over her. Not the weight of obligation, but something closer to recognition, like a door opening onto a version of her life she hadn't known she was looking for until it was standing right in front of her. She thought about her mother's words from the hospital room. The measure of a person isn't what they do when it's easy to be brave. I'll stay, she said finally, but I want something in return. Victor's eyebrows lifted slightly, something almost like amusement flickering across his face. Name it. I want to actually learn this world properly, Emily said. Not just stumble through it because I happen to understand German at the right moment. If I'm going to be in dangerous rooms, I want to understand exactly what I'm walking into every time. Training, real training, not just luck and a spilled bottle of wine. Sal, still standing quietly near the window, let out something that might have been the ghost of a laugh. She's got a point, he said. Luck runs out eventually. Victor considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. Sal will train you personally. Situational awareness, communication protocols, everything you need to walk into a room like that warehouse and come out the other side without needing to rely on instinct alone. Good, Emily said, and felt something settle inside her. Not quite peace, not yet, but something adjacent to it, the sense of a foundation being laid beneath a life that had felt, for 4 days, like it was made entirely of loose, shifting ground. 3 weeks later, Emily stood in a different private dining room in a different restaurant, though this one was considerably more familiar now than the last one had been. She wore another tailored suit, her hair pinned back in the style she'd grown accustomed to, standing quietly at Victor's side as he shook hands with a group of Japanese investors interested in expanding a legitimate logistics partnership. She listened to every word exchanged in the room, cataloging tone, hesitation, the small tells that separated honest negotiation from something more dangerous. Nothing about tonight's meeting raised any alarm. It was, refreshingly, exactly what it appeared to be, a straightforward business discussion between people who had no interest in murdering anyone at the table. Still, old habits died hard, and Emily found herself watching every face in the room with the same careful attention she'd learned to apply since that first night, the training Sal had put her through over the past 3 weeks, sharpening instincts that had once relied entirely on luck. You're doing that thing again, Victor murmured to her quietly as the investor settled into a round of drinks, the formal negotiation concluding on friendly, uncomplicated terms. What thing? Watching everyone like you're waiting for someone to lie. Old habits, Emily said. Besides, you're the one who told me to stay sharp. I did, Victor admitted, something warm flickering behind his usual composed expression. I suppose I should be careful what I ask for. Across the room, Daniel stood near the bar, laughing quietly at something one of the investors had said, his German flowing smoothly and honestly now, every word exactly as it should be. No gaps, no hidden meanings, nothing left unspoken that needed to be. Emily watched him for a moment, remembering the broken man she'd found sitting on an overturned crate in a warehouse 3 weeks earlier, and felt a quiet satisfaction at how far he'd come since then. His sister had settled safely in a new city, far from Munich, far from anyone connected to Brandt's shattered network. Daniel visited her every few weeks now, something Victor had insisted on, understanding perhaps better than most men in his position exactly how much family mattered when everything else in a person's life had grown complicated and dangerous. "Klaus is talking again," Sal said quietly, appearing at Victor's other side, his voice pitched low enough that only the two of them could hear. "Gave up 2 more names this week. Whoever's running this network above Brandt is getting nervous. Word is they're pulling back operations across 3 different ports." "Good," Victor said. "Nervous people make mistakes." "Nervous people also sometimes make desperate moves," Sal said. "Just keep that in mind before you get too comfortable." Victor's jaw tightened slightly, the reminder landing with the particular weight of a man who understood exactly how thin the line was between victory and the beginning of an entirely new war. "I know," he said. "We stay careful. We stay ready." Emily listened to this exchange with the same quiet attentiveness she brought to every conversation now, understanding that the danger from 4 weeks ago hadn't fully disappeared. It had simply gone quiet, retreated into shadows where it would wait, patiently, for the next opportunity to strike. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the knowledge didn't frighten her the way it once might have. It simply sharpened her, gave her purpose, reminded her exactly why Victor had wanted someone in the room who could hear the truth, no matter how carefully it was hidden. The evening wound down slowly, the Japanese investors departing with warm handshakes and promises of future partnership, and Emily found herself alone with Victor in the emptying room, the last of the staff clearing glasses in the background. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always." "That first night in the restaurant before any of this happened, did you already suspect Daniel? Really suspect him, not just some vague feeling?" Victor considered this question for a long moment, staring at the empty table in front of him like he was looking backward through time to that exact moment. "I told myself I didn't," he said finally. "But some part of me knew something was wrong. I'd built my entire career on reading people, on knowing when something didn't add up, and every instinct I had was screaming at me that something about those German meetings felt off. I just didn't want to believe it, because believing it meant confronting the possibility that someone I trusted completely might be capable of betraying me. And now? Now I understand something I probably should have understood a long time ago," Victor said. "Trust isn't about never being wrong about people. It's about building relationships strong enough to survive being wrong sometimes, strong enough that when the truth finally comes out, there's still something worth salvaging on the other side of it." Emily thought about that, about Daniel's tearful confession in the warehouse, about the fragile trust being rebuilt between the two men, one careful day at a time. She thought, too, about her own life, the mother she'd nearly lost, the fear she'd carried since childhood about not being enough, not mattering enough, being too easily overlooked by a world that valued louder, more visible people. "I used to think being invisible was the worst thing that could happen to a person," she said quietly. "Growing up, I mean. Watching people look past me my entire life, at school, at work, everywhere. I used to think it meant I didn't matter. And now? Now I think invisibility is just a kind of power nobody bothers to notice until it's too late for them to stop it," Emily said. "The night I whispered those 4 words across your dinner table, nobody in that room thought a waitress was worth watching closely enough to catch her doing anything at all. That's exactly why it worked." Victor studied her for a long moment, something quietly reverent in his expression, the look of a man recognizing, perhaps for the first time fully, exactly how much value had been standing invisibly at the edges of rooms his entire life, waiting for someone to finally notice. "You were never invisible to me," he said. "Not from the moment you spilled that wine." Emily laughed softly, some of the old tension from that first terrifying night finally, fully releasing from her shoulders. "I ruined a very expensive suit that night." "Best money I never had to spend fixing anything," Victor said, and something in his tone, dry, warm, unguarded in a way she rarely heard from him, made her laugh again, genuine and easy. The kind of laugh she hadn't allowed herself in longer than she wanted to admit. They stood together in the quiet, emptying restaurant, two people who had walked into each other's lives through violence and betrayal, and had somehow built something unexpected out of the wreckage. Not friendship exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Something built on the rarest currency either of them had ever traded in: absolute, tested trust. Outside, the city moved on around them, indifferent to the quiet transformation that had taken place inside one waitress's life over the course of a single, reckless night. Somewhere across town, Emily's mother slept peacefully in her own bed for the first time in months, her heart steady, her medical bills paid, her daughter finally able to visit without the crushing weight of unpaid debt hovering over every conversation. Somewhere else, Daniel Reeves called his sister just to hear her voice, grateful in a way words could barely capture for a second chance he hadn't expected to receive. And somewhere in a federal holding facility, Klaus continued talking, piece by piece dismantling a network that had once believed itself untouchable, one name at a time. Emily Carter had walked into that private dining room 4 weeks earlier as exactly what everyone in the room expected her to be: invisible, unremarkable, easily forgotten. She had walked out of it as something else entirely, the one person in a room full of powerful men who had actually been paying attention, the one voice quiet enough to go unnoticed and brave enough to speak anyway. That was the truth the whole city would eventually come to understand, whispered first in shipping offices and restaurant kitchens, then in wider circles entirely, that Victor Moretti's most trusted advisor wasn't a lawyer, wasn't a bodyguard, wasn't anyone born into power or privilege. She was a waitress who refused to stay silent when it mattered most, and in a world built on lies, calculation, and careful betrayal, that single, stubborn refusal had proven more powerful than any weapon in the room. Some people are remembered for the power they were born into. Emily Carter would be remembered for something rarer, something no title or fortune could manufacture: the courage to speak the truth when silence would have been so much easier, and the conscience to keep speaking it again and again, no matter what it cost her. That was how a waitress no one thought to notice became the one person a mafia boss trusted with his life. And that is exactly how her story ends, whole, complete, and undeniably true. And maybe in the end, that was the real story underneath all of it. Not the mafia boss, not the German investors, not the gunfire echoing through an empty warehouse. Underneath every decision Emily Carter made in those 4 terrifying days was a single, quiet force driving all of it forward. And it wasn't ambition, and it wasn't fear, and it certainly wasn't money. It was love. Plain, stubborn, unglamorous love. The kind that doesn't announce itself with grand gestures. The kind that simply shows up again and again in the smallest and most dangerous moments of a person's life. Think about what actually happened that first night. A woman with nothing to gain and everything to lose chose to risk her job, her safety, possibly her life, for a stranger she had no reason to protect. People like to imagine courage as something loud, something built for movies, a hero standing tall while music swells behind them. But real courage rarely looks like that. Real courage looked like Emily Carter's hands shaking as she tipped a wine bottle, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone in the room could hear it, whispering 4 words she wasn't even sure would matter. That kind of courage doesn't come from confidence. It comes from love, the love a person carries for the idea that other lives matter as much as their own, even lives that have nothing to do with them. And where did that love come from, if not from her mother? Every choice Emily made in this story traces back, eventually, to a hospital bed and a woman who had worked 2 jobs her whole life just to keep her daughter fed and safe. Emily didn't learn courage from a textbook any more than she'd learned German from one. She learned it by watching a mother who never once complained about the weight she carried, who smiled through exhaustion because that's what love does when it has no other choice. Emily carried that lesson into a private dining room without even realizing she was carrying it, and it was there, waiting, the exact moment she needed it most. That's the first truth this story quietly insists on, if you let it. Love doesn't ask permission before it shows up. It doesn't wait for the safe moment, the convenient moment, the moment when there's nothing to lose. It arrives precisely when the cost is highest, and it asks you anyway, again and again, whether you're willing to pay that price for someone else's sake. Emily paid it without fully understanding what she was buying. She just knew she couldn't live with the alternative. But this story isn't only about the kind of love that saves people. It's also, painfully, about the kind of love that can be twisted into a weapon. Daniel Reeves didn't betray Victor because he was cruel or greedy or hollow inside. He betrayed him because he loved his sister more than he feared the consequences of staying silent. Somewhere in Munich, men who understood exactly how love works had looked at Daniel Reeves and seen not a translator, not a professional, but a brother. Someone whose deepest weakness was the same thing that made him human in the first place. They didn't threaten his money. They didn't threaten his career. They threatened the one person on earth he would do anything to protect. And that was enough to turn 6 years of loyalty into 6 months of quiet, agonizing betrayal. There is something almost unbearably sad in that, if you sit with it long enough. The very thing that makes us most capable of good, our love for the people closest to us, is also the exact thing the cruelest people know how to exploit. They don't come after your principles. They come after your heart, because they know your heart will always win that argument. Daniel didn't choose Brant over Victor because he respected Brant more. He chose his sister's life over his own integrity, because that is simply what love does when it's cornered. It doesn't calculate. It doesn't weigh options rationally. It protects at any cost, even a cost that Popeye's everything else a person has built. And yet, here is the second truth this story leaves behind, quiet but just as important as the first. Love that has been twisted by fear can still, eventually, find its way back to something honest. Daniel didn't stay broken. The moment he understood his sister was safe, the moment the weight lifted even slightly from his shoulders, he did the hardest thing a person in his position could do. He told the truth. Not because it was easy, not because it would erase what he'd done, but because love, even love that has been forced into betrayal, still longs to be honest again the first moment it's allowed to be. That's why Victor forgave him, not because forgiveness was convenient, but because Victor understood something most people spend their whole lives refusing to understand, that love under threat doesn't always look like love. Sometimes it looks exactly like its opposite, and the only way to tell the difference is to ask, patiently, painfully, what was actually driving the choice. Then there's Victor himself, a man the entire city feared, a man whose name alone could empty a room. And yet look at what love quietly did to him over the course of this story. It didn't make him weak. It made him more human than anyone expected a man like him could be. His first instinct upon learning about Daniel's sister wasn't rage. It was protection. He sent people to Munich before he even confirmed Daniel's confession, because some part of him understood instantly exactly what desperation for a loved one's safety could push a person to do. A man built entirely out of business and calculation still recognized love when he saw its fingerprints on someone else's choices, because somewhere underneath the reputation, Victor Moretti still remembered what it felt like to care about someone enough to risk everything for them. And what about the strange, unlikely bond that formed between Victor and Emily themselves? It wasn't romantic, not in the way stories like to package these things for easy resolution. It was something rarer and, in its own way, more valuable. It was the kind of love that exists between two people who trust each other completely, who have seen each other at their most frightened and most honest, and who choose deliberately to keep showing up for one another anyway. Victor didn't just offer Emily a job. He offered her something almost nobody in her life had offered before, the belief that she mattered, that her voice was worth protecting, that her courage deserved more than to be spent once and forgotten. That, too, is love. even if no one in this story would ever call it that out loud. It's the love of being seen, finally, by someone who refuses to look past you the way the rest of the world always has. Maybe that's the quietest, truest lesson buried underneath everything that happened in that restaurant, that hospital room, that warehouse full of gunfire and broken trust. Love isn't only the grand, sweeping kind people write songs about. Sometimes love is a mother pushing through illness so her daughter never has to feel unloved. Sometimes love is a daughter learning a foreign language in hard, painful circumstances, never imagining that same language would one day save a man's life. Sometimes love is a brother breaking under threats he never should have had to face alone, and finding, eventually, the courage to tell the truth anyway. And sometimes love is simply a man deciding that a person who had every reason to walk away deserved to be seen, valued, and protected, instead of forgotten the moment the danger passed. Every act of courage in this story, when you trace it back far enough, was really just an act of love wearing a different name. Loyalty, sacrifice, honesty, protection, forgiveness. These are simply the different masks love wears, depending on what a moment demands of it. And maybe that's why the story lingers the way it does, long after the gunfire has stopped and the danger has faded into memory. Because underneath the Mafia bosses and the German conspirators and the desperate warehouse standoff, this was never really a story about crime at all. It was a story about what people are willing to risk when someone they love is standing in harm's way, and about how far that love can travel, through fear, through betrayal, through silence, and still find its way, eventually, back to the truth. Because in the end, love asks only one thing of us, over and over, in ways big and small. It asks us to notice the people who are struggling, the people who are frightened, the people everyone else has stopped bothering to look at closely. Emily noticed a lie nobody else in that room could hear. Victor noticed a woman nobody else thought was worth a second glance. Daniel eventually found the courage to notice that silence was costing him more than honesty ever could. Love. Real love is simply the discipline of paying attention to what matters, even when the world around you is doing everything it can to convince you to look away. And that, more than any gunfight, any betrayal, any twist of fate in a private dining room, is the truth this story leaves behind for anyone willing to carry it forward. The people who change everything are rarely the loudest ones in the room. They are the ones who loved someone enough to notice what everyone else missed, and who loved them enough, still, to say something about it, even when staying silent would have been so much easier. That is the story of Emily Carter. That is the story of a waitress nobody thought to watch closely enough, who turned out to be watching more closely than anyone. And that is, in the end, the truest measure of love there is. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act anyway, because someone else's life mattered more than your own comfort ever could.